All right. Well, I know Rebecca has a lot to include in her presentation, so I don't want to take up any more of her time. So I think we're going to go ahead and get started as people are still coming in. But thank you all for joining the this Europe Export Education webinar. It's part of our series. My name is Gretchen Gilbert. I'm the Fund Match Program Manager with WUSADA, just in case you don't know me. And I see Sammy just joined. She's Global Connect Coordinator with WUSADA for our Global Connect program. And with that, I'm going to kick it over to Rebecca to start her presentation and let her introduce herself. If you all will please hold your questions till the end, we'll do a Q&A session there. You can raise your hand or put them in the chat at the end.
Thanks, Gretchen.
Get away, yeah.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for having me and for inviting me along to do this webinar on the EU. My name's Rebecca Wilson. I work at a company called Hopscotch Season. So we are an international marketing agency. Our main office, our head office is Paris, but we have offices throughout the world. I'm actually based in London, but I cover UK and EU, in particular for kind of US cooperator groups. So I worked with WUSATA for a few years. I've worked with Alaskan Seafood. I worked with a Spirits, Discus and Washington Wine and a few others. So yeah, I've been around for a while, been working for about 25 years in food and drink and tourism marketing. So hopefully I can give you some insights into the EU market. And of course, I'm available for questions. And if there's any follow-ups afterwards, then I'm more than happy to kind of share my contact details and what have you. I know that Sammy, you said you were going to share pass them around. So I'll get cracking with the PowerPoint slides. Let me just put that on full screen for you. Can you see that okay?
Yes,
yep.
That's
okay,
great.
Thank you. Thank you. Right, okay, so we're going to cover an overview of the EU to start with and the agri-food sector. We'll then take a look at the kind of trading partnership between the EU and the USA as it stands. I wanted to talk a little bit about consumer trends to you so that you can see where the similarities are across the EU. And then we'll look at the retail and food service landscape. Now, one thing to note as well is that whilst we're talking generic EU, we are going to have a bit of a country focus. There are 3 countries that WUSATA is currently active in or plans to be active in of particular note, which is Germany, Spain and the Netherlands. So you'll see those referenced throughout the presentation, and I will have a little bit more of a deep dive into each of those countries in part 6. Then we'll wrap up with a look at the kind of market entry conditions and an overview of the kind of, the strengths and opportunities and so forth. And as Gretchen said, we'll try and leave some time for some questions, but anything that we don't get through, I'm happy to pick up offline, no problem. Okay, so let's get cracking. This is the 101 of the EU. So the EU actually started with 6 founding members, but now there are 27 countries or member states, as they're called officially. The United Kingdom, as I'm sure you're all very aware, left the EU back in 2020, and it will remain that way, rightly or wrongly. We have 450 million, inhabitants across the EU, but 2/3 of those are actually concentrated in 5 countries. So Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and Poland. If we talk about the kind of, just to give you an idea of the scale of each of those 5 markets, we've got Germany, for instance, is 83.4 million population. Spain is 48 million population. The Netherlands, which is one of our focus markets I mentioned to you, is an 18 million population, so much smaller. We cover in the EU 4.2 million square kilometres. And we use the euro, but not in all 27 countries. So there's only 20 countries have opted into the euro. But of course, the euro means that we can facilitate trade and consumer exchanges across all of those different markets. So we have, we're taking the EU as a whole here. And one thing that is very important for you to bear in mind in all of this is that they are actually 27 countries that have their own trends, their own buyer behaviours, their own personas, their own retail structure, their own food service landscape. So there are similarities, and that's what we will cover today. But please do bear in mind that each country is different within itself. So looking at perhaps the most relevant part of what the EU means for us, is the single market and the customs union. So the single market is actually the cornerstone of the kind of EU integration. And what the single market does is it allows free movement of goods, services, capital, and people across all the member states. But it's not just the 27 member states that are included in this, because the single market also includes Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway through what is called the European Economic Area, as well as Switzerland, who have partial access. So if you're looking at Switzerland, then some of these kind of regulations will not apply so much when you're talking about single market and free movement of goods and services. 87% of all food and drink that's produced in the EU is sold within the single market. So they trade, EU countries all trade very well, very freely amongst themselves. And intra-EU exports increased 6% annually between 2013 and 2023. Extra EU exports, so exports out of the EU, also increased, and that was 5% in the same period. So the big advantage really for us here is that once goods get into the EU and they have cleared what are very strict entry requirements, they can then be sold to any one of the single market countries. So the 27 countries plus these additional ones through the EEA. Then we have the customs union. And the customs union was established in 1968. And the idea behind the customs union was to harmonise all customs duties across the EU. So that means that all goods imported from outside the EU are subjected to exactly the same tariffs. So if you were to send your salmon to Spain, you would pay the tariff that would be applied would be exactly the same as if you were to send it to Greece. And the customs union also eliminates internal tariffs. So once it's in this example, Spain, it could then be re-exported to any other country within the EU, and no internal tariffs would be applied. So it means that there's lots of freedom. And it means that all the customs authorities really across all EU countries work together as one entity. So this is where we see it as a trading bloc. We as the US see it as a trading bloc, even though they are individual countries. So looking now at the agri-food sector, the scale of the industry is rather large. There are 304,000 companies that work in food and drink. Most of those are, kind of small and medium-sized companies, and it employs 4.7 million employees. It's the largest agri-food exporter in the world, and it maintains a positive trade balance of about 80 million euros. So the top producers, looking in terms of the EU as a producer, the top producers are France, which has 17% of the total EU production, and Germany. Then Germany is closely followed by Italy and Spain. And for information, the Netherlands, our focus country, another one of our focus countries, is 41 billion. So you can see the scale. The one thing that we need to also bear in mind about the Netherlands, which we will see a bit more as we go through the presentation, is that the Netherlands really punches above its weight. And this is partly because it is the gateway to the EU, in particular for US products. It's where the ports are really handily located. And so lots of product will come into the Netherlands and then be re-exported across the EU. So not necessarily for consumption in the Netherlands. You see here that self-sufficiency in agri-food, so in terms of the production in the EU, is increasing. So we are becoming more self-sufficient. However, that is true in some areas and in some categories and not all. So again, this is a very broad brushstroke statement that is not necessarily depicting the actual situation, because as soon as you start to dig into different countries and different products, it is different across the EU. And then the other part that we will come back to, and I'm sure is of interest to some of you, is organic food. The thirst for organic product is growing. And in fact, now in the EU, the land that is farmed, 10% of it is dedicated to organic production. So you can see on the right-hand side here, the countries that import into the EU. in terms of market share and value, and the US is on 18% here, so it sits in 13th, I think, or 14th position there. So it's a very important partner to the EU. So here are the main crops that we have ourselves here in the EU. There's wheat and spelt, beetroot. We have maize, vegetables, potatoes, and barley. But looking at the future, whilst we're talking about, you know, kind of more self-sufficiency, coming down the track are some new regulations, particularly to do with kind of environmental standards and decarbonisation and so forth. And these new practices will have to be implemented across for producers that produce in the EU. And this is going to increase production costs, which will have an impact in the future to the market, of course. So these higher costs of production could potentially open the market to, you know, to kind of other, to further imports, i.e. from the US. The projection for the market is of growth. We're expecting to grow 5.23% between 2025 and 2030. And you'll see that beverages is a large part of the growth in this in the EU market. So I thought it was worth just pausing a moment so you can have a look at the similarities and differences between the EU and the US. So you've got some idea of context and scale. So the EU, in terms of inhabitants, has actually got a larger population than the US. And the life expectancy is higher by a few years. However, GDP is quite far off where the US is. If you can see, our GDP per inhabitant in the EU is only 37,000 euros, which is significantly lower than the US. And once we look at our country focuses again, actually, you'll see that some countries are very different. So this is, of course, the average. We have a higher employment rate across the EU in the Eurozone. And our inflation across all EU countries is higher than in the US. Although the Eurozone, and when I say the Eurozone, I mean the countries that use euro as their currency. So inflation in the Eurozone is much lower. So that should give you some idea of the scale. And looking at the trade partnership, already the US and the EU are very, very close trading partners. The US is the largest partner for EU exports, sorry. So 19.7% of all EU products go to the US. Then looking the other way around, US products coming into the EU, USA is the EU's second largest import partner at 13.7%. It's the 14th largest supplier of agri-food products by value. Although there was a small decrease actually in the volume of trade between 22 and 2023, about 5%, but we're expecting that to come back, you know, if the conditions remain the same. The Netherlands here, as you'll see, was the largest importer of US goods. As I mentioned, it's pretty much because of the location of the ports and the ease of redistribution and re-export across the EU. Incidentally, Germany is the largest exporter of goods to the EU. Germany is a total powerhouse in the EU. So these are the products that are coming into the EU from the USA at the moment. This is from 2023. In terms of categories, the top one by quite some distance is oil seeds, oily fruit, grain, straw, fodder. We also have up there edible fruits and nuts, and we have beverages, spirits and vinegar. You'll see further down the line, we have vegetables and roots, cereals, tobacco products, and then a little further down the line, you've got things like confectionery and sugar and so forth. You've got a bit more of a drill down here, so you can see how it's evolved over the 10-year period. It's blocking my screen, so I can't see the numbers in front of me. So tree nuts, you'll see, whilst it's huge in terms of value, has actually decreased by about 2% over the 10 years, which, I mean, given the volumes, we could say that's almost stable. Soybeans has had a huge jump, and distilled spirits in particular has had a great 10 years. Although we need to take into account that they've gone through quite a bumpy road with some of the tariff situation over the last kind of 5-10 years as well. So some of those numbers look a little bit skewed on the distilled spirits front. Okay, so that's a lot of data for you, but what I wanted to give you a picture of really is what our consumers are like. So how do we spend? How do we eat? How do we, what role does food play in our lives, or food and drink? Here in the EU, we invest significantly in food. We spend an average of 3,500 euros a year, which is about the same in USD. So it's about 22% of household expenditure. It does vary a bit, again, country by country. But I think the most important message for me here to tell you about is that the way we eat is different. It is evolving, but our culture, European culture, is very different to American culture. We spend much more time eating, full stop, and we also spend more time eating together. So if you see on the right-hand side here, there's this chart here shows you how long people spend across Europe eating and drinking. And you'll see that in particular in Southern Europe, in France, Italy and Spain, we're over 2 hours per day eating. Then we compare that to the US, which is just literally just notches over 1 hour. So already you can see that the importance given to eating is very, very different. And the other point to note really here that is that it's a real social experience. You'll see again that there are some trends that are moving in a slightly different direction, but it still remains a massively social experience, especially in those kind of southern countries. Most Europeans will eat together, and they will eat together at the table. We're talking about between 66% and 92% across all countries, and that's in comparison to 47% of Americans. I mean, I think about my Spanish family, for instance, and it's normal at lunchtime and dinner time. They sit down, cutlery across the EU. So it's really important for any businesses looking to export to really think about those kind of shared dining experiences, about how kind of social connections and storytelling is going to be important, especially in those more Mediterranean countries. Then we have here a poll here across the EU 27. So this is the member states of the EU. And 58% of EU consumers said they don't follow a specific diet. However, what we see here is fairly small percentages, but significant because they're growing quite quickly. We've got flexitarians here, which is people who are really reducing meat consumption. It's at 12% here, and they are growing very quickly. Likewise, vegetarian is growing very quickly, which is at 5%. And we're seeing a growth in pescatarians, so people who eat fish and not meat, and gluten-free consumers. The gluten-free and lactose-free, particularly in Spain, actually, in southern European countries. In terms of health consciousness, it's really becoming mainstream. So whilst they don't follow any nutrition rules, they are very health conscious. 60% of consumers said they actively try to eat healthily, and 40% avoid artificial ingredients and preservatives. So anything GMO free is very, very relevant for an EU market. So, and these kind of health trends in terms of eating healthily and actively avoiding artificial ingredients and preservatives are really, really strong across older Europeans. So that's the kind of age 60 to 65 cohort, even though it's growing across all age groups. So labeling any health benefits, clean ingredients, any dietary compatibility and so forth on packaging or in kind of, marketing communications, obviously is going to be very important here. And then what is the consumer looking for? What are the buzzwords here? What's the, what makes people buy in the EU? The first one that stands out quite clearly is freshness. It seems to be fresh above all else. Then they're looking at taste. And then in joint third place, we've got quality and price at 49%. Now, for me, it's quite surprising that price comes so low. If I were to look at these numbers for the UK, price would be at the top and probably about 80%. So really, quality, taste, freshness, this storytelling, this authenticity, this traceability, these are the messages that this market wants to hear. We have the plant-based revolution. We can't ignore the plant-based revolution. Sales have jumped 21% in 2 years, reaching 5.8 billion euros. It's, you know, some markets, as some countries are seeing it more prevalent than others, but this is a trend that is going to continue growing. You can see here that in Germany, we've got a market that's worth 1.91 billion euros. Now that's huge. Looking at our focus markets on the bottom left-hand side here, you can see that the Netherlands, which is, you know, we used the kind of idea of eating at table as, you know, kind of Spain, Italy, and France, and spending more time. In the Netherlands, which is not a southern country, it's much more about convenient food. So this is the kind of growth that we're seeing in the Netherlands. In Germany, packaging is really important to them. They want sustainable packaging. And in Spain, it's healthy eating and no artificial flavours and preservatives. So you'll see that across each country market, there are slight nuances about what they look for. And I said at the beginning that we were going to talk a little bit more about organics. Organics is a big market opportunity across, I would say, all EU countries. Germany is perhaps the biggest opportunity for organics, followed by France. Germany is actually the second largest organic market globally, behind only the US. And if you think about the scale of Germany versus the US, that's quite something. In terms of market shares, it's a 6.3% organic market share in Germany, and the Netherlands follow. Netherlands is a 4.4% market share. What's quite interesting, though, actually, is on this graph at the bottom, you can see that Denmark, whilst it comes kind of, you know, halfway down the graph, it has the highest market share of organic because they have a smaller population. If you go to Denmark, you know, everywhere you go, every supermarket, every food service outlet will talk about organic food and drink. So if you've got organic, you know, obviously Germany and France are key markets for you. You know, this is where there's a really high degree of organic penetration, especially meat, bread and dairy. Any kind of organic labelling is important as well. And we come on to the labelling in a little bit. In fact, here, this is where we will talk about some organic labelling. So in the EU, this is quite important. This is the EU labelling system that I wanted you all to be aware of, because it has a very high degree of consumer awareness and is certainly the way that kind of consumers are wanting to purchase. So it will help you in terms of your conversations with any future buyers and so forth. So in the EU, we operate under what's called the precautionary principle. So any chemical, for instance, is deemed, or pesticide or any additive is deemed unsafe until it is proven otherwise, which is different to the way that it works in the US. This leads me into kind of tell you about how this idea of quality, traceability, and standards is of huge importance to consumers here. So these two round labels that you'll see on the top right-hand corner are PGIs and PDOs, protected geographical indication and protected designation of origin. So these two labels are issued by the European Commission to products that are there are different standards, but normally produced in one particular region to a very specific set of standards, or in various regions to a specific set of standards. And they have certifications, they are audited to make sure that they adhere to these standards, and then they can put the label on the pack. So this is, like I said, very recognised by the consumer. And in fact, 80% of consumers across the EU say that these labels directly influence purchasing decisions. One on the bottom is the organic label as well. So you would see that on pack across the EU. So this is really important because obviously for you as US producers, you will not be able to have these labels on your pack, but you need to understand that these are the sort of labels that consumers are looking for. So what we need to do instead is to really position American products, your products, as authentic alternatives with, you know, your unique heritage and your own unique standards and authenticity and so forth, because these are the stories that you're up against. Then looking at retail, the grocery market across the EU grew 8.6% in 2023. There's a lot of that was kind of inflation that drove that growth. However, it has still seen a growth. And market share of supermarkets remains pretty stable at 37%. Discount retailers are growing. It's slowing a little bit, but they are still growing. And online sales remains fairly small, but it's also growing. Private label is important for us here in the EU, in some markets more than others, but we have, as a general rule of thumb, 38% of sales. And in fact, 83% of consumers see those as equal or superior even to branded items. Then if we look at food service, food service is also going across Europe. Europeans like to eat out a lot, but the formats are really changing. So what we see in food service is an 11.1% growth. And you can see here with Germany, Netherlands and Spain on the screen, the numbers do vary across the different country markets. But we are seeing a change in how how people are consuming at food service. So out of home consumption is we're seeing growth in quick service restaurants, the kind of faster service, food to go or sit down and have a quick meal, and the kind of commercial restaurants are seeing market share decline. But even with that said, out-of-home consumption is still, taking up a third of all total consumer spending on food and drink products. A word must be left as well for the kind of rise of experiential dining, culinary experiences, these kind of premium ones. They're really kind of mostly driven by the younger generations. So younger Europeans, Gen Z, millennials are looking for these experiences. Okay, we'll have a little look now at each of our three country markets, starting with Germany. Now, Germany is 84 million of the world's wealthiest consumers. They're the largest EU economy. They're the largest importer of consumer-oriented agricultural products worldwide. And they also produce a lot. They are still, even though they're a big producer, they're a net importer of ag products. So they have food and drink is the fourth largest industry in Germany, and they employ about 638,000 employees. So their biggest areas, their biggest segments are meat, dairy, baked goods, and confectionery. They are not self-sufficient in several products, especially in fruit and vegetables, and animal protein and feed and so forth. They have 13% of their own production of their farms operate organically, which gives you an idea of how important it is. In terms of their kind of consumer trends, 53% are healthy eaters, and as with kind of pan-European, they are reducing meat consumption, they're avoiding plastic packaging, and they're avoiding artificial flavours. The largest plant-based food retail market in Europe is in Germany, if you have plant-based products. It's seen 42% growth in the 2 years between 2020 and 2022. So plant-based product is very, very big. These are ethical consumers, though. So purchasing decisions in food and drink are often seen as kind of political statements or lifestyle statements. So non-GMO, free-range eggs, fair trade, it's almost political to them. So we need to bear that in mind. And also quality labels and sustainability certifications are really important. If anybody here works in seafood, MSC is almost a condition of entry into the German market. In terms of retailers, they're highly consolidated. They have a high degree of market saturation, and low prices are important to them. Their top 4 grocers have 76% market share. They have a growth of single households, which means that there's more demand for convenience retail, actually, which is shown in some of our countries across the EU, but not all. The growth of discounters, they've got a very large share of discounters here, predominantly because Aldi and Lidl are German companies. But the growth of these discounters is starting to slow a little. And this is because customers want more choice now. They're looking for more quality and convenience at the same time. Those discounters are perhaps not able to offer that so much. Private label is big for them. Then in terms of food service, it's quite a fragmented industry. It's split between kind of commercial and institutional sectors, and about 55 billion in restaurants of the $87.8 billion that they produce in food service. So again, you can see here that the growth is at 7.7% versus 2022 to 2023. So they like to eat out. And I don't want to read all of this out because you will have the slides afterwards to see what's got good potential. So here we have split down which products have good sales potential that are in the market already. So we have here nuts, organic, sustainable, fish and seafood, dried and processed fruit, beef and game, which has to be hormone free. And then not so present, but does have good potential, is health food, natural and health food, ready-to-eat meals, bakery products, and any kind of innovation. You'll see this idea of innovation come up a bit. Then if we look to the Netherlands, like I said, it's the gateway for the US, for US products into the EU, and it's the largest importing country within the EU as well. So they have a fairly small population, but their GDP per capita is 53,764, which, if you remember the average, this is much higher than the average for the EU. It's the second largest agricultural exporter globally, but also a huge importer. Key production sectors are dairy, eggs, meat, fruit and vegetable. And 66% of their total land is used for agricultural purposes. So, but if we look at retail here, 2 retailers control 60% of the market. We've got Albert Heijn and Jumbo, who you may well be familiar with. Discounters here are 20% market share, so less than Germany, but we've got a higher online market share. In terms of the kind of consumers, they are healthy eaters. 58% say they're healthy eaters, which is higher than Germany, but they still want convenient, fast food. So we need to really be looking at healthy, convenient food. In terms of food service, the industry turnover is $15.3 billion US dollars, so it's smaller, and it's mostly hotels, restaurants, and cafes who take the lion's share of that invoicing. Then the product prospects into the Netherlands, we have nuts and dried fruits, we have fresh produce, alcoholic and non-alcoholic beverages, superfruits, it's a great buzzword, containing high levels of antioxidants. Then we've got food preparations, beef, almonds, and pistachios, but US products that are not present in significant quantities but have potential. It's high value products, anything with special certifications. And here's that word again, innovative sauces, condiments, and confectionery as well. And then moving on to Spain, our third country focus, we have a population here of 47.4 million. Their GDP per capita is much lower. It's a huge producer. They have lots of farming, and they cover a huge area of agricultural land, produce things like olive oil, citrus, and vegetables. So they export a lot, as you can imagine, and most of those exports go within the EU. The main non-EU suppliers to Spain are Brazil, China, Argentina, Morocco, and the US. So there's quite a lot of competition out there for Spain as a market. And the most imported products are seafood, corn, fresh fruit, vegetable oils, dairy products, and biodiesel. So there's quite a few opportunities here in Spain, despite it being such a big producer. So 60% of Spanish consumers want to be healthy. So this is a really strong market for health, for anything with health claims, with good health claims, for wholesome food products. They try to avoid artificial flavors and preservatives, and there's a big thrust towards getting rid of all plastic packaging. In fact, some new legislation is coming in Spain shortly to try and avoid plastic packaging. The grocery retail sector is expanding, but it's mostly driven through inflation. Price sensitivity is big in Spain, and private label growth as a result has been increasing. So we now see that the grocery market has got a private label of 30.8%. We are seeing the growth of discount retailers like Lidl and Aldi, even though it's a bit smaller. But there's not a lot of consumer loyalty across retail in Spain. They will shop wherever is cheapest or best quality, whichever is most important to them. It's dominated by two different brands, though, Mercadona and Carrefour, who I'm sure you will have heard of. Online is very small. Online grocery is very small for them. It is growing, but it's small. And then looking at food service, this is a huge part of their culture and economy. This is the biggest market that eats out across the EU. It has the second highest number of food and beverage service businesses across the EU. It's very diverse. It's very fragmented as well. Bars and coffee shops actually get the highest out-of-home expenditure, followed by restaurants. So you can see there, that kind of gives you an indication of how these people are eating and drinking. And food service has continued to grow in Spain. I don't think they're going to change their eating out habits at all. And spending 34 billion on out-of-home food and drink in 2022. Okay, so here we see that opportunities are, with sales potential, we've got nuts in there, we've got peanuts, we've got pulses, sunflower seeds, fish and seafood, surimi, which is quite small actually, and spirits. Interestingly here, what's coming up is functional food, innovative health food. These guys are really looking for something that has that is good for them. And so gluten-free, lactose-free, I mentioned before, and anything that has kind of health benefits. And pet food has also come up for Spain. So I'm conscious that time is ticking on. So I do want to have a look quickly at some of the EU regulations about entering the market. There are EU regulations and there are country-specific regulations. So I would always say that whenever you're looking to export to a country, you need to check with the local USDA office for any requirements for that particular country. But all member states need to follow the EU directives. So that means that they need to follow all of the correct documentation that the EU is stating. That means that all of the standards are harmonized, all of the food safety requirements are harmonized, animal welfare standards are harmonized, everything is harmonized across the EU, and then you may get an extra level that is added by the local country. So what you will need if you are exporting to the EU is you will need export certificate. That's a health certificate for animal products, phytosanitary certificates for plant products, quality certificates. If you have them, they may give you reduced import duties. And then, of course, you've got bills of landing, commercial invoices, and all the kind of normal stuff with exporting. The member states themselves are actually responsible for all the documentary checks and the physical checks, but they have to adhere to the EU standards. Then we have labelling requirements, packaging requirements, food additives and contaminants need to be called out, residue levels for pesticides, and the rules for composite products. So all of these are all standardised across the EU. whereby language needs to be stated, the language needs to be correct on the packaging, the origin needs to be stated, the ingredients and the GMO status needs to be stated. Then we have some equivalency arrangements. So EU recognises the National Organic Programme from the US as equivalent. So if you're part of the NOP in the US, then you will be allowed to call your product organic in the EU. And then we have the Veterinary Equivalency Agreement, which allows for different inspection requirements between the US and the EU. However, both parties can establish their own level of public health protection, and they're safeguarded with that. Then a few nuances for each of our different focus markets. In Germany and Netherlands and Spain, all the labelling needs to be in German, in the particular language, sorry, in their relevant language. In Germany, for instance, wax fruit needs to be labelled as such. Phosphates need to be called out. Any single-use plastic bottles needs to have a minimum of recycled plastic. There are additional levels on pesticide revenues, and there's other certifications for fresh foods. Whereas if we go to the Netherlands, they absolutely say you need to call out the Nutri-Score. Then they have an additional requirement for allergen labelling on alcoholic beverages. There's some special use food, so anything that's dietary or vegetarian, for instance, needs to be called out on pack. There are rules for specific food enzymes, which if it's of interest, I can send to you, and also some rules on packaging. And then if we go to Spain, dairy, whilst it needs to include the country of origin, which is the EU law, Spain also say they want the country of processing if it's dairy. Spain have an additional tax on non-reusable plastic packaging. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there's further requirements on packaging that is going to be implemented over the next couple of years. So you can see there are some nuances in the requirements for each country market. What is common to all country markets is that one of the key ways to enter markets, is through trade shows. So these are the trade shows here that Wusata is participating in over the coming 2 years. So we have Anuga in Cologne, which is in October in 2025. And this is a cross-category trade show, food and drink. Then in Spain, we have the Seafood Expo Global coming up in May in Barcelona. Which there will be a booth for companies there as well. And then in France, we have Cial, which is also cross-category, and that takes place in Paris in 2026. So that takes place every 2 years. That's why there isn't one this year. So they're the trade shows that Wusata takes part in, and there are also a few other kind of promotions and activations going on around Europe, and especially in those focus markets that we've covered. So that they might be the kind of the ways for you the options for you to start looking at if you want to export to the EU, because these events you can start to meet potential buyers and have these discussions with them. So before we go on to Q&As, assuming you've got some questions, I just wanted to wrap up with a SWOT, really. There's been a whole heap of information that I realise I've thrown at you very quickly. But just to summarise, we have in the EU, it's a very mature market. We have over 400 million consumers, and it's growing year on year. So each year there's an additional 400,000 consumers in the EU. The population is growing, and the consumer spending power is fairly high, especially in some of the kind of more, I would say more developed market. We have a very high traditional food value and very high expectations. We want good quality food, and our retail and food service distribution system is very well established as well. In terms of weaknesses, we've got, I think it's the same globally. We have the cost of living crisis and inflation that is across all member states. And let's hope that starts to ease fairly soon. And then one of these kind of weaknesses that we've identified here is that the additional environmental practices that I mentioned earlier that are being implemented by the EU are going to increase prices, but that is increased prices of products that are produced within the EU. So perhaps an opportunity for you. Then if we look at the threats in the bottom right, there is a preference for the EU or national or even regional production. If you think about the PDOs and the PGI labels that I showed to you, this is what a lot of the consumers are looking for. Because feeding into that second bullet point, these will give them a guarantee of high food safety, production, and the standards that go into producing those foods. A threat or a challenge, I would say, for anybody who's looking to export to the EU is the diversity of the EU. Like I said right at the beginning, we're talking about this as one export market, but the truth is that you're talking to 27 different countries. So what we really need to do, or what you really need to do, is identify which of those countries is your target countries and why, because a one size fits all it is just not really going to wash. We have very mature buyers, very knowledgeable buyers in the EU, and they will be looking for products that really fit their customers. If you're looking at retail, for instance, a SKU needs to come off a shelf before they can buy a new SKU. So it has to be a very compelling proposition. It has to be very tailored. Costs of third country exports is on there. I mean, that's fairly evident. There are customs costs, tariffs costs, packaging costs, labeling costs, agent costs that all need to be borne in mind. But if they can work for you, exporting is hugely beneficial, of course. We have the elephant in the room, which is the potential trade war and tariffs, and we're all just kind of watching and waiting to see what happens with that. Then in terms of threats, we've got the younger age groups that are less likely to eat meat, but more likely to eat plant-based products. So depending on where your product sits, there's a threat there or an opportunity. And then we've got the avoidance of artificial flavors and preservatives. Now, many products that come in from the US do have flavors and preservatives that perhaps are not as accepted by the consumer in the EU as it is in the US. But then let's finish with the opportunities, because really, as I said, we've got a growing number of consumers. The food and drink market is growing. Online sales are growing. Plant-based is growing. Vegan, vegetarian friendly is growing. Gluten-free is growing. Organic foods is growing. This is all great stuff. And sustainability, which I know that, in the US, some of your products have fantastic sustainability credentials. There's a huge demand. Niche products, innovative products, buyers are really looking for this. And drinks, as you've seen, I mean, we didn't dive too much into category specific data, but you'd have seen from the graphs that drinks in particular is a huge growth. And then cheaper, we're not a massively price driven market, but we do look for quality. So value is important. Quality at the right price is important. So that about brings me to the end of my presentation. I'm sure that there are a few questions, so I will hand over, Gretchen, maybe to you to take over.
Thank you. Yeah, that was great. Sammy, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Rebecca and Hopscotch, for putting that together. Lots of super valuable information in that presentation. So being mindful of time, let's just go ahead and jump right into questions. There is one in the chat, so I'll start with there. It says, distilled spirits is a big category. Can you address any detail on wine specifically?
Yes, I can. So, okay, so when it comes to wine, there is a real interest actually in US wine. So if we think about the EU as a consumption market, traditionally the European consumer will consume European wine, in particular French, Spanish, and Italian wine. Those countries and regions within those countries have been having, it's no secret, a hard time of it in terms of production volumes, mostly driven by climate change. So there are great opportunities for new exporters into the EU to carve out a niche in those markets. In fact, wine buyers are actively searching out new wine regions at the moment. That's across the UK and the EU. This is because there have been challenges in pricing and challenges in supply for their usual source markets. And then you twin that with a consumer who is looking for new flavors, new stories, new ideas. They want to be able to say to their, to go to somebody's house to a dinner party and bring, something different, and this is what the consumer is looking for. So there are very big opportunities in wine, definitely. There are challenges in terms of the way that the tariffs work on wine, which means that the pricing of US wine in the EU can sometimes be quite a bit higher than some of the EU counterparts, which is something that needs to be considered. And the storytelling becomes even more important because you have to really build a perceived value into that product. Does that help?
That was Janet's question, and I don't see them coming off mute, so I hope so. Yep.
Right.
Okay. Looks like it does. Great. All right. Are there any other questions? You can go ahead and use the raised hand function to make sure we are calling on people in order. Or the chat is also open. All right, very quiet, taking that as no questions. All right, wow, doesn't look like we have any questions. I'm assuming you covered everything in your presentation. Are there any other closing remarks you want to share or anything else, Rebecca?
Not really. I mean, I think I just want to leave everybody with the thought that there are huge opportunities. Already the EU and the US are great trading partners, and notwithstanding everything that's going on at the moment, there are huge opportunities out there. And I would encourage you to go to these trade shows and meet with people. If this is your first foray into exporting into the EU, definitely go and meet these people and keep in mind some of those key messages, because that's what the buyers will be listening out for.
All right, thank you very much. Well, since we do have a few more minutes, I'm going to ask a question that I'm not sure if we have anyone here that is able to ask, but what are the opportunities in regards of seafood? Specifically, are they looking for fresh seafood, frozen? What's that market kind of like?
I would say that frozen has got the biggest opportunity. Part of the challenges with seafood is if you're looking for the fresh market, the logistics costs tend to mean that it's a very large premium, very high premium. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of seafood around Europe. So it's the frozen market has a lot of potential. There are challenges, again, within the industry at the EU level at the moment in terms of sourcing. There are lots of issues with the kind of cod and haddock quotas, for instance, where there isn't enough whitefish in the market. So it needs to be sourced from elsewhere. So a lot of buyers are looking for alternative species that have greater availability and are better value, because prices have gone up in that market. Then also, if we're looking at the kind of flatfish and sole species, we have some of the more traditional producers across the EU, such as the Netherlands, have got various challenges in terms of not being able to fish as much as they require. Mostly because either the volumes aren't there or because they don't have the correct vessels to do so. So again, there's lots of opportunities there. If we look to species like salmon, I mean, I could talk about fish forever. If we look to species like salmon, that plays beautifully into the functional fitness, the functional food, messaging, you know, the kind of health messaging that really is where it's at the moment. Everybody talks about protein. It's not just bodybuilders.
Great, thank you very much for that. I do see we have someone typing in the chat, so I'll just give them a moment to see if they want to input a question. And while we wait for that, if anyone else has any, feel free to ask. All right, it says, is there an opportunity to get the EU labels on the products we send with some sort of inspection or current US certificates, similar to the organic label that is able to transfer?
No, not at the moment. The reason being those PDO and PGI labels, which I think is what you're referring to here, Mary, they are very specific to particular regions. So if I give you an example, prosciutto di Parma, okay, so Parma ham is a PDO, if I'm correct, and it has to be produced within the region of Parma to particular standards. So it's not just about the standards, it's also to do with the location. Now, the PGI is a lower certification, if you like. It's not quite as stringent in that it doesn't have to be to exactly that same region. Different inputs can be from different areas, but it still has to be produced in a certain manner in a certain area. So it's whilst it's the standards component, there's also the geography component. So I don't think, I mean, you know, this is way above my pay grade that the labels could be, you know, kind of used interchangeably in the same way as the organic label, certainly not currently. But the important thing is that any kind of authenticity or traceability is called out in all of your literature and your communication materials, because this is what people are looking for, you know. Did that answer the question, Mary? Let me know if there's anything else you need me to expand on.
Yes, thank you. That certainly answers it. I was just wondering of some of the US labeling that we currently have, if that's something that we can transfer onto the package when we export it to the EU. Just like all of the packaging would also need to be in the like in German. It's so if I'm sending to Germany and I want it to go into Germany, but then someone in Spain wants it, would it be necessary to have in Spanish and in German? Okay, yeah. So different packaging for each one.
Exactly, yeah. So this is where it does have complications, because whilst it's harmonized across the EU, you still need to meet the national country guidelines. So yes, you would have to have German packaging for your product that's ending up in Germany, and you would have to have Spanish packaging for your product that's ending up in Spain. Obviously, if it's a bulk product that you're talking about, then it, you know, it becomes a completely, you know, for reprocessing or what have you, then it becomes a different discussion. But for the consumer, yes. In terms of your bringing your US labels onto the pack, and so, for example, if you have, I'm not so familiar with your US label, so do forgive me, but if you have a US label that you use domestically, that you would like to put onto the pack that is going into Spain, for instance, that then is a question. There isn't a regulation, I believe, at EU level. It would be a question about the national regulations. So whether Spain would let you do that or not. And actually, I think that even if Spain let you do that, it then becomes a discussion with the retailer. Now, if I talk about my retailers in the UK, they're quite reluctant to put additional logos on, quite honestly. You know, apart from the recognized ones. So unless it's very recognized by a consumer, then it's quite honestly unlikely.
Okay, so is there an attraction to a state like we have California apricots? Is that something that the EU likes to look at? Because some of our other partners that we ship to, do enjoy the fact that, oh, this is coming from California. Although right now I think everything is not so uncertain. So, but we do like to put in the California natural apples or Washington natural apples. And so I'm not sure if that's still something that is attractive and to the consumer.
Yes, very. At a state level, very attractive. Yes, our consumers really like to see. We have so many amazing connotations with states at a state level. So if we talk about Washington apples or, you know, California prunes or whatever it may be, you know, it's evocative for us, you know, and in itself it tells that story. So I would say yes, it's very important. What is less relevant, I think, to the EU consumer is calling something out as an American apple. There is more buy-in at a state level. So for you to call it I don't know, an Alaskan salmon, for example, rather than American salmon.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. That answered a lot.
You're welcome.
All right, Rebecca, if you're comfortable with, as I know we are a minute over, there is one last question in the chat. Okay. So it says, do all food and beverage products in the EU now require, and forgive me if I'm saying this wrong, caloric labeling? Caloric labeling. And then it says for wine, it's a product produced after December 8th, 2023.
I might need to check that. I don't think it's an EU regulation. I think it's a country by country regulation, but I will need to check that, Janet, if you don't mind, and I'll come back to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Okay, perfect. We will make this recording available on our website in the next day or so, and we will also send out the PowerPoint and any relevant information to go along with it. Thank you all for joining, and big thank you to Rebecca and Hopscotch for putting this together.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right. Well, I hope everyone enjoys the rest of your day. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to the Global Connect inbox.
Thank you so much.
Of course.
Thanks.
All
Bye-bye.
right. Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye. Nice to see you, Rebecca.
Thanks, Gretchen.